8 times in 10 years. The answer had been the same. My name is Elena Marquez. I'm 47 years old, and I've been Principal Cloud Migration Architect at Innovate Tech for longer than most of the leadership team has held their titles. The quarterly leadership review unfolded exactly as it always did: glass walls, muted slides, carefully calibrated optimism. At the head of the table sat Rachel Vaughn, our CEO, composed and deliberate. We're excited to announce our new Director of Cloud Transformation. For a brief second, the room tilted toward expectation. Then Rachel said Kevin's name. Again, polite applause followed. Controlled, corporate, Kevin, 31, fresh MBA, stood and nodded like this had always been inevitable. I'd trained him. For the past 3 years, I'd unofficially been performing director-level responsibilities, designing enterprise cloud architectures, signing off on multi-region migration plans, and mentoring the last 2 directors who were promoted over me. I carried the risk while they carried the titles. Rachel turned toward me with the same sympathetic smile I'd seen 7 times before. Elena, you're too valuable where you are. Next year, too valuable. 2. Translation. We need you fixing things, not leading them. No one looked surprised. No one looked uncomfortable, Bo. In this room, my indispensability had quietly become my ceiling. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't let my face shift even slightly. That was the part I'd mastered: professional composure in moments designed to test it. But something inside me recalibrated. Not anger, clarity. I had been waiting for recognition. Now I understood the structure. And, as usual, this story is a work of fiction, created by our editorial team for storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and organizations are fictional. Any resemblance is purely coincidental. Thank you, and let's continue. Because if you're already doing the job, why are you the only one not allowed to hold the title the morning after the promotion announcement? Nothing looked different. My inbox was full. Sterling's migration timeline still needed architectural approval. Pacific Coast had a multi-region deployment entering its final validation phase. Morrison Logistics was preparing for a phased infrastructure cutover. On paper, I was still Principal Cloud Migration Architect. In practice, I was the one who signed off on every major design decision that carried financial risk. That afternoon, I opened the master contract repository, not out of spite, out of curiosity. Sterling Financial, $22 million migration. Pacific Coast Retail, $18 million. Morrison Logistics, $15 million. Only 2 of those contracts truly mattered. I pulled up Sterling's agreement first. 87 pages, standard enterprise language, liability caps, SLA tiers, termination provisions, then Appendix D, buried under technical governance and continuity, designated technical authority. The clause was specific. Any architectural deviation exceeding defined risk thresholds required approval from the named lead architect. If the named lead architect was removed or replaced, the client must receive 30 days written continuity notice. If continuity could not be reasonably assured, the client reserved the right to initiate reassessment of the contract. I scrolled down. Named lead architect Elena Marquez. Not my title, my name. I checked Pacific Coast and same structure, same clause, same designation. Morrison didn't include it. Their contract relied on role-based authorization. Replaceable, clean. But Sterling and Pacific Coast together represented over $40 million in active revenue. I forwarded the relevant clause to legal with a simple question. Please confirm that my designation as named technical authority remains active. 10 minutes later, the reply arrived. Yes, no amendment has modified your designation. I closed the file. The board reviewed executive summaries. They debated quarterly targets. They talked about leadership optics. Appendix D wasn't something they read. I didn't mention it in the meeting that followed. I didn't hint. I didn't threaten. I simply understood something I hadn't fully articulated before. If your name anchors the contract, who actually controls continuity? I didn't resign. I didn't confront Rachel. I didn't ask Kevin how he planned to lead a department he'd never architected. I adjusted. For years, I had absorbed friction before it reached the surface. When cross-team misconfigurations slipped through, I corrected them quietly. When executive summaries blurred technical reality into something prettier, I rewrote them before they reached the board. When deployment risks appeared at 11:30 at night, I logged in without being asked. This time, I stopped. Not dramatically, not irresponsibly. I stayed within scope. If Kevin's team misconfigured a load balancing rule, I flagged it once and waited for correction instead of fixing it myself. If an executive report misrepresented migration risk, I sent a concise clarification rather than rewriting the entire narrative. If a late-night message didn't involve revenue exposure or client data integrity, I responded during business hours. The systems didn't collapse. They became slower, more textured, more honest. Architecture approvals began taking longer. Kevin asked for quick input more often. Sterling reported minor deployment instability that would previously have been resolved before they noticed. I didn't ignore anything. I simply stopped compensating for gaps that weren't mine. At the same time, I began building something private, an operational map. Who escalated first when something failed? Who actually had authority to sign off? Which project timelines assumed my presence without documenting it? Which clients requested me by name versus by department? Patterns emerged quickly. Decisions labeled team consensus depended on my approval. Risk mitigation timelines silently assumed my midnight availability. Kevin's architectural confidence softened the moment escalation moved beyond slide decks. Dependency, once anecdotal, became measurable. I didn't weaponize it. I just recorded it. Because there's a difference between being essential and being acknowledged. And I was done confusing the two. What becomes visible when you stop protecting people from their own gaps? The failure hit at 9:12 a.m. Eastern. A Sterling Financial's core database replication cluster stalled during peak trading volume. Orders queued, latency spiked, regional failover didn't trigger. Within minutes, their operations team escalated. Kevin's group jumped in first. Conference bridges opened. Logs were pulled. Hypotheses were thrown around. I watched the incident channel populate with confident language and no resolution. Hour 2 passed, then hour 4, by hour 6, Sterling's internal risk officer joined the call. Someone calculated the exposure allowed, $1.8 million per hour. The room shifted from technical to existential. At 11:40 p.m., my phone rang. It was our CTO. Elena, we need you to take a look. I didn't move immediately. What authority am I operating under, I asked? A pause. Kevin was technically the director now. The architecture belonged to his team. I wasn't going to override a production environment without clarity. 5 minutes later, an email arrived. Subject, temporary architectural override authorization. Kevin's name at the bottom. I joined the bridge. Within 20 minutes, the pattern was obvious. The replication configuration had been adjusted during a recent performance optimization. Failover thresholds had been misaligned. Automatic switchover was blocked by a parameter no one had validated under live load. It wasn't catastrophic. It was careless. I corrected the configuration, forced synchronization, monitored stability across both regions. 2 hours later, Sterling's systems normalized. Silence settled over the call. The next morning, an email arrived from Sterling's executive leadership. Clear, direct. Given last night's incident, we require Elena Marquez to serve as designated technical authority for all remaining migration phases. No ambiguity, no corporate cushioning. Legal was copied. Documentation followed. The incident wasn't just resolved, it was recorded. Because what changes when the client names you instead of the company? The email from Sterling wasn't just operational, it was legal. 48 hours after the outage, their general counsel sent a formal contract reaffirmation. It referenced Appendix D directly designated technical authority. The language was precise, stripped of diplomacy. Elena Marquez shall remain the named technical authority for all architectural approvals associated with the current migration agreement. The clause was quoted in full. If the named technical authority were removed, replaced, or made unavailable, Sterling reserved the right to initiate reassessment of the contract under continuity provisions. Reassessment, not termination, not yet. But reassessment meant review of deliverables, timeline renegotiation, potential penalty exposure. It meant uncertainty. Legal filed the reaffirmation as an addendum acknowledgement. No one escalated it beyond compliance tracking. It was treated as procedural housekeeping. 3 days later, Pacific Coast requested something similar. Their CTO cited operational confidence and asked for written confirmation that I would remain the architectural sign-off authority through final deployment milestones. Their amendment was shorter, cleaner, but it carried the same implication. 2 enterprise contracts, $40 million in active migration revenue, both now explicitly tied to my continued presence. The board never discussed it in a leadership forum. It appeared as a footnote in a legal update packet. Rachel focused on quarterly growth metrics. Kevin spoke about process optimization. No one connected the structure. I didn't bring it up. I simply requested copies of the executed acknowledgments for my records. That was the moment the leverage stopped being theoretical. It was no longer about who fixed what. It was contractual. If I left, reassessment would trigger automatically, not because I demanded it, because the clients had documented it. I didn't resign that week. I began planning. I updated my portfolio, not with responsibilities, but with measurable outcomes. I reached out to 2 former colleagues who had gone independent. I reviewed my non-compete language again. Everything was quiet. Everything was professional, but something had shifted permanently. Activation wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Have you ever watched leverage become contractual without anyone noticing? I submitted my resignation on a Thursday afternoon. 3 weeks' notice, professional, concise, no accusations. The timing was precise 2 days before Q4 close. I delivered the letter directly to Rachel Vaughn's office. She read the first paragraph, looked up, and for the first time in years, didn't have a rehearsed sentence ready. "This is sudden," she said carefully. "It's aligned," I replied. Within an hour, the consequences began surfacing. Sterling scheduled an emergency continuity call, and not with Kevin, with me. Pacific Coast paused final milestone approval, pending clarification on architectural authority continuity. Finance flagged Q4 forecast projections internally. A single note appeared in the executive dashboard: risk designated authority, transition revenue exposure, review required. The tone shifted immediately. The conversation was no longer about promotion cycles or leadership pathways. It was about continuity risk, revenue stability, and client confidence. Rachel requested a private meeting that same evening. The retention tone was measured at first. "We can revisit the director role. We can accelerate the leadership transition. We value you." I listened. She didn't mention Appendix D. She didn't mention Sterling's reaffirmation, but she knew something structural had shifted. By Friday morning, my calendar was filled with emergency sync requests. The CTO asked for transition documentation. Finance wanted impact modeling. Kevin wanted a technical walkthrough to ensure continuity. I answered questions. I clarified scope. I committed to nothing beyond my notice period. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made demands. I had simply stepped away from the structure they assumed would always include me. And when you step away quietly, who feels the instability first? The first visible shift was operational. Sterling postponed their final go-live window. Official language cited continuity reassessment. Unofficially, their CTO made it clear they would not finalize migration without confirmed architectural authority. Pacific Coast suspended renewal discussions for Phase 2. Their legal team requested written assurance regarding sign-off governance after my departure. Architecture approvals began to stall internally. Kevin's team drafted proposals, but without my signature authority, enterprise-level risk thresholds couldn't be cleared cleanly. Decisions lingered in review loops. Escalations multiplied. The system didn't crash, it slowed. And in cloud migration, delay is a cost multiplier. Then Sterling issued a formal document. Subject line: formal notice of concern. It referenced the designated technical authority clause explicitly. It stated that pending confirmation of continuity, the $22 million agreement would enter reassessment review. It outlined potential SLA exposure if delivery stability was compromised during transition. Legal was copied, finance was copied, the board was copied. Pacific Coast followed within 48 hours, freezing their $18 million renewal discussion until authority structure was clarified. Combined exposure over $40 million. An emergency board session was convened the next morning. For the first time, the discussion wasn't about quarterly growth or expansion strategy. It was about structural oversight. One board member leaned forward and asked Rachel directly, "Why is a single architect tied to nearly half our active migration revenue?" Silence. Rachel's answer was careful. "She has been critical to delivery stability." The phrasing mattered. Critical to delivery. Another board member followed with a quieter question. "Then why was she passed over 8 times?" No one looked at me. Kevin attempted to speak about leadership pipelines. about scaling technical teams, but his words thinned under scrutiny. It became visible what had always been true: titles had moved upward, but authority had remained anchored. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The document spoke clearly enough. This wasn't a rebellion, that it was a structural exposure. When a company treats indispensability as a utility rather than leadership, it builds risk into its own foundation. And when that foundation shifts, it doesn't explode, it recalculates. If your departure triggers formal notice, were you ever truly replaceable? The first offer arrived before the board session officially adjourned. Director title, immediate effect, a 35% salary increase, revised reporting structure. It was presented as recognition. By the next day, the package expanded: equity participation, performance-linked stock grants, a commitment to formalize strategic authority. Kevin would be reassigned to oversee internal optimization. The director role would be mine without another review cycle. Rachel asked for a private meeting. This time, she didn't use future tense. "We can correct this now," she said. "You should have been positioned differently, but let's fix it." Fix, not promote, fix. She outlined a long-term incentive plan that would have made me one of the highest compensated technical leaders in the company: deferred bonuses, retention multipliers, executive visibility. It was thorough, strategic, carefully calculated. I listened. Then I declined. Not angrily, not dramatically, simply, "My decision stands." By afternoon, Sterling's CTO called my direct line, not through sales, not through legal. "Elena, we're reviewing continuity options. If you establish your own advisory practice, we would prefer to retain you directly." He paused before adding, "We want you, not the firm." There it was, the distinction no retention package could erase. At Innovate Tech, I was too valuable to promote. Outside it, I was valuable enough to anchor a contract. Rachel's final message that evening was brief. "Is there anything that would change your mind?" There wasn't, because this wasn't about compensation anymore. It was about structure. When they finally recognize your value, is it respect or risk management? The shift from persuasion to pressure happened quietly. 3 days after I declined the final retention package, an email arrived from corporate legal. Formal notice. It cited my employment agreement. It referenced non-compete language. It alleged potential client solicitation. The tone was restrained but unmistakable. The final paragraph included draft language referencing possible injunctive relief if competitive engagement continued. They weren't negotiating anymore. They were testing containment. I forwarded the letter to my counsel. We reviewed the agreement line by line. The non-compete was geographic limited to operating a competing firm within a defined radius of company headquarters. It did not prohibit independent consulting in the broader industry. It did not restrict client-initiated engagement outside defined territory. More importantly, Sterling and Pacific Coast had formal reassessment rights tied to my departure. Their outreach was documented. Their legal teams had initiated contact. There was no proprietary data transfer, no confidential architecture diagrams copied, no internal systems accessed beyond my notice period. My counsel responded with a structured rebuttal. It clarified the geographic limitation. It documented client-initiated contact. It referenced the designated technical authority clause explicitly. The final line was deliberate should further interference continue. We are prepared to file counteraction seeking declaratory relief and recovery of damages related to reputational harm. The company withdrew the threat within 48 hours. No apology, no explanation, just silence. 2 weeks later, Sterling signed a $14 million annual retainer with my new advisory firm. Pacific Coast followed with a $13 million agreement structured around phased infrastructure oversight. $27 million in recurring revenue. Additional mid-tier contracts brought total committed exposure past $44 million. The numbers were no longer theoretical. The structure had chosen. What remains of control when the contracts choose the architect 6 months later? The numbers felt different when they carried my name. Elena Marquez Cloud Advisory operated out of a modest downtown suite with 6 senior engineers, each chosen carefully, each fully aware of why they were there. The pipeline sat at $52 million across phased enterprise migrations and advisory retainers. It hadn't started smoothly. The first 2 months were tight. Sterling's payment schedule lagged by 3 weeks, and I remember calculating payroll at midnight, double-checking projections before the first major deposit cleared. One former colleague I respected declined my offer to join, unwilling to leave the perceived stability of Innovate Tech. Independence wasn't glamorous, it was responsibility. Meanwhile, Innovate Tech reported a revised earnings forecast. Over $40 million in contracts had either migrated or failed to renew. Public language framed it as strategic client realignment. Internally, leadership restructuring followed. Kevin was reassigned to project oversight without direct reports. Architecture governance was centralized under a newly formed risk committee. Structure, corrected too late. I saw Rachel again at an industry cloud infrastructure summit in Chicago. No tension, no spectacle. We spoke briefly about market volatility and enterprise migration fatigue. She looked composed, but more careful. I underestimated the structural risk, she admitted quietly. There was no need to revisit history. Before we parted, she asked, would you ever consider returning? I held her gaze. You didn't lose me when you denied the promotion. I said evenly, you lost me when you positioned me wrong. Later that week, Sterling issued a public press release naming me Chief Migration Advisor for their multi-year infrastructure strategy. My name stood alone under the announcement. Not a title borrowed, not a role delayed, a position aligned with authority. Because if you're indispensable but invisible, you're positioned wrong. And if you're carrying the structure, why stay where you're hidden? Thank you for listening. If this story made you stop and think, hit like to support, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment with your perspective. We read every one.